Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I have to give it to the mainstream media. They really do their job well. When it comes to pushing a particular narrative and getting the people to believe it, they do their job, man. I mean, they seem to do it really well. How many people out there were believing some of the lumber stories that you heard? How many people were believing the egg price stories that you heard out there? All the stuff that they gave for reasonings why lumber prices went up and why egg prices went up hasn't changed. None of the reasonings have changed, but yet the prices have come out of it. Why? It's because it's a supply and demand issue. It doesn't have anything to do with the amount of money that's in the system. Now, I know that's very difficult for people to wrap their heads around, but if you can't explain why it is that eggs are now back at their normal price, why lumber is back at its normal price, if you can't explain that, then you don't understand what it is that's taking place within the central banking system. Right? They had a problem. They stated it over and over again, that inflation expectation was persistently too low. This was a major issue for the Federal Reserve. And now inflation expectation is very high. And it is the job of the Federal Reserve to make sure that it is anchored at this inflation expectation. They do not want this to change. Now, a lot of people don't understand why that would be. They don't understand why it is that the Federal Reserve would have a problem with inflation expectation being too low to begin with. If you don't understand these things, then you're not understanding the strategies coming from the Federal Reserve. And this is the problem. The dollar is coming to destroy the world. People do not understand this. They think that the de-dollarization of all these global sovereign nations out there trying to get out of the dollar is somehow going to destroy the dollar. And they are right, but they are wrong on the idea that it's going to destroy the purchasing power. See, the Federal Reserve has a demand for their liabilities out there. And this is a very, very difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around. This was the problem with the Federal Reserve. When they asked him, how much money do you plan on printing? They said in their response, it depends on how much demand for our liabilities there are. That right there should tell you, right? It's about the amount of debt that is issued out in dollars. Nations around the world have what they refer to as offshore bonds. These offshore bonds are sovereign debt, right? Countries that have nothing to do with the United States, nothing to do with our corporations, nothing to do with our banking system, nothing to do with our government, have written debt, bonds that are due in dollars, in US dollars. Half of all the offshore bonds that are written in US dollars. Think about it when those things come due. How much demand for dollars are going to exist to simply get out of that contract? That is the demand for the Federal Reserve liabilities that nobody is talking about. I mean, very few people talk about it. Brent Johnson, Jeff Snyder, a handful of other people talk about this, but very few articles do I see that are written out there when they talk about de-dollarization, talk about the fact that they would have to have these offshore bonds cease to exist. And the very idea of getting out of these bonds means that there would be a huge demand for dollars, just simply to pay off those debts. And now double this up, because those debts are being used as if they were dollars. Now think about how much dollars actually exist out there if a nation can just simply write up debt in dollars and then get to use it as dollars. Do you see what's happening out here when it comes to the amount of dollars that are being used? It's insanely huge. And there is no other nation that even remotely comes close to doing what the dollar is doing. Because the United States is willing to do something no other nation is willing to do, and that is to go into an incredible amount of debt. That means they get to issue out a lot of U.S. treasuries. And these U.S. treasuries are then used by corporations, sovereign nations, private people outside of the United States. They demand these U.S. treasuries because it's a safe and liquid asset, meaning that if they hold on to treasuries, at least they get some sort of return. And because the treasuries are so liquid, meaning that you can sell them at any given time, that they are used as if they are cash. That right there is something that no other nation is willing to do, to issue out that much debt to willing to go into that much debt to do it. And then on top of it, how do you get the dollars out to the world? Well, you have to buy stuff. You have to buy their products, their manufacturing. By buying their manufacturing, you export the dollars, and now you're able to get dollars out to the world. Very few nations out there are willing to take on the trade deficit that the United States is willing to do. They import a lot more than they export, but what they export is that debt, that U.S. treasuries. That is the export. When they issue out debt, they are bringing in dollars. And that is the new money coming into the United States. Think about this. When a nation goes and starts using their sovereign currency, that starts to strengthen that currency. Look at India. Right now, they are not happy with the fact that the rupee is increasing in value, in strength against the dollar. What that does is it destroys their exports. It makes it ever more difficult for nations out there around the world to buy Indian stuff. And so what they want to do is weaken their currency. The way they do that is by buying dollars. Demand for dollars that exist outside of the United States. This is one of the BRICS nations. Think about Russia, who had a hold of these rupees from selling them so much oil. Now nobody wants their rupees. What do they have to do? They have to sell them for dollars. Because everybody is willing to accept dollars. But not everybody out there is willing to accept rupees. And now I know that there's going to be the argument, well, these nations can just work with themselves and Russia can just buy Indian stuff. Well, there's stuff that India doesn't have that Russia wants. And these other nations that want to sell it to them, they don't want rubles, they don't want rupees, they don't want yuan, they want dollars. Because they have debts that are due in dollars that they need to pay. Offshore denominated debt. Think about this. This is why the dollar will come to destroy the world. If people tried to get out of the dollar itself, there will be less dollars out there to use. If there's less dollars to use, then there's less dollars to pay off debt. And there's far more debt than there is dollars to pay it off. As this starts to take place, it will strengthen the dollar as the amount of dollars available for people to use and a world reserve currency basis will begin to shrink. That is really where the problem starts to exist. Can the Federal Reserve even print at a pace that is fast enough to cover all the dollar-denominated debt that truly exists out there? See, how many people talk like this? Very few. Very few people take on this strategy. And very few people take on the idea that the Federal Reserve had a problem with persistently low inflation expectation. Right? So now inflation expectation is really high, and the media pushes out the idea that the dollar is worthless, nobody should be in it. Well, that gets you out of the dollar. Well, here in a few years, you're going to find that the dollar is probably going to strengthen more than you could ever possibly imagine, as people are simply trying to get out of the dollar itself. And people are going to look at the dollar and they're going to say, hey, the dollar is strong. Everybody should be in the dollar. The dollar is the safest place to be. And that is going to be incorrect. But the mainstream media will be pushing that narrative. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.